Yeah, I'm Gail Hepson. I'm a member of the Work Equalities Institute, and myself and Emma Bannister, who's also a member, will be chairing the session today. So we're really pleased to welcome Liz Atkinson and Rebecca Harris from the Greater Manchester Centre for Voluntary Organisation to discuss their work on employers' attempts to introduce flexible working in a way that can help carers and parents get back to work. And it's got to be said that we arranged this originally in March, pre-COVID, pre-lockdown. But actually, it's so interesting now how the debate has changed. You know, flexible working's now become this norm. But I suppose, crucially, it's not equating flexible working with home working. They are two, you know, it's one form of flexible working. So the idea now is to try and think about how Liz and Rebecca's work can be reframed in this new context in a way that can help reduce inequalities. So that's what we're really, really excited about having them here. I'll just formally introduce them. So we've got Liz, who has Liz and Rebecca both have a specialism in inclusive employment practices in Greater Manchester. And have been involved in a number of projects supporting flexible working and inclusive employment practices. So Liz has worked on employment projects for young people on the periphery of the labour market, has experience of co-production with different stakeholders and looking at user-led programmes with adults with learning disabilities. So that's been her focus. And we've got Rebecca as well, who's worked on projects aimed to support carers aged over 50 into employment, and has worked for Carers UK as well, on, you know, advising employees on how to make their workplaces more carer friendly. So this is a really important discussion. I mean, it's very interesting now thinking about it in this context and how we can move forward with the context we're in and use some of these tools that they've been developing to reframe the debate in a more inclusive way. So that's the sort of background to the seminar. Just some housekeeping as well before we get started. I think if you could all mute yourself while the presentation's going on, that would be great. We also want to encourage the use of the chat function. And here Emma Bannister's going to be monitoring any questions. If you want to submit questions, we're really encouraging that throughout, and then Emma will manage those at the end of the session. And hopefully, you know, we'd ask you to unmute yourselves and ask it in person if you'll feel comfortable with that. The session is getting recorded and will be available as a podcast. And also, I suppose, in terms of the chat function, the other thing to say is that Rebecca and Liz are going to ask questions where we can all use the chat function to answer. So any of us who are involved in teaching, we're going to get lots of tips for how to make it a more interactive session. They're also going to use breakout rooms for a little bit later on in the session as well to get some more interaction going. So I think we can all learn as well as the topic. We can learn this more interactive style. We've got an hour and a half for the full presentation and questions. So, you know, it's see how it goes. So I think that's it. I think I can hand over now to Rebecca and Liz. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Brilliant. There we go. So that was our introduction, but actually we want to start off by getting to know you a little bit and doing that through the chat function. So in the next couple of minutes, if you would all just use the chat function to introduce yourself. Obviously we can see your name, but maybe give us an idea of your role or where you work, but also just as a kind of a bit of an icebreaker, it'd be interesting to find out what you know or what you think we do on a day-to-day basis at GMCVO. I realised when I was looking at my slides earlier, because we're using our kind of branded slides, our strap line is up there in the top right corner. I wouldn't pay so much attention to that strap line. I think that might lead you down a path, down an incorrect path. I think it would be slightly misleading, but it would just be interesting to find out what you think we do at GMCVO. So we'll just take a minute use your chat function, put in a little bit about what you do and what you think we do. Okay, well, for people that said we work across Greater Manchester, the clue was in the title really, isn't it? But that's absolutely true. We do work across Greater Manchester, and we're the voluntary, community and social enterprise sector support and development organisation. So it's about supporting the development and the resilience of those organisations across GM that work in the voluntary, community and social enterprise sector. So you can imagine over the last 3 months, the organisation has been incredibly busy supporting organisations to remain resilient throughout this time. We do a lot of work to support organisations to network, to be aware of funding opportunities. But our strategic aims, I can get these up, yeah. So our main strategic aims are to improve the quality of life for people in Greater Manchester. And if we just look at that through the context of the work that Rebecca and I were doing at Caring, Work and Living, we would take that to be people who not only live but work in Greater Manchester, because obviously there will be people who work in Greater Manchester that don't live necessarily in Greater Manchester. So we took that quite wide for the purposes of our project. All of GMCVO's work is focused on contributing to reducing inequalities between people and places, and that will start to make more sense in a moment when we talk more, take a more focused look at our Caring, Work and Living project. And all of GMCVO's work aims to support a responsive, connected and influential VCSE sector. And that's kind of in a way part of what we're doing today, really. We're going to look at how the work that we've done as a VCSE sector organisation on Caring, Work and Living can influence wider employment landscape. So if we focus more on Caring, Work and Living, which was the project that Rebecca and I have been working on, that is, and you've, I think lots of people referenced this when they were in the chat, when they were thinking about what GMCVO did. Caring, Work and Living was a Greater Manchester-wide project which supported employers to develop their recruitment and employment practices to make their job opportunities more accessible to returners. So we're thinking there about, at the point of recruitment, how to attract returners, but also how to retain parents and carers that are in the workforce. Returners, for the purposes of this project, were people who had taken at least a year out of work to undertake parental or caring responsibilities for children or adult relatives. So, for example, lots of returners we worked with were providing care to elderly parents, or potentially an older child with learning disabilities, or a spouse or another relative. We did have some kind of scope to be a little bit flexible with that definition. So, for example, I know we worked with some people who hadn't been out of work for 12 months, but had to leave their employment because their employer was no longer able to offer them flexible opportunities, and it felt punitive, really, to say, no, we won't support you. So we did have some flexibility, and the project ran from the start of June last year to the end of May this year, and was funded by the Government Equalities Office. So what did we actually do? What support did the project provide for returners? I think key to most of the work that GMCVO does, not just Caring, Work and Living, is that we don't deliver anything kind of centrally from the St Thomas Centre in Ardwick. The support that returners got was delivered in their own communities, so across all of the 10 boroughs. And the way that we did that was by thinking back to those strategic aims around working with a connected voluntary sector, connected voluntary sector, we worked with a variety. I think we worked with 23 different organisations across Greater Manchester, ranging from kind of public sector, housing associations like Stockport Homes, through to small local jobs clubs, charities like Volition that were able to work with anyone from across Greater Manchester, through to very local organisations. And they supported returners either on an individual basis or sometimes, you know, through running group sessions. And the kind of support they offered would be things around CV or interview support. As a project, we organised some workplace visits. So we worked with employers to offer a group of returners a visit to, for example, Trafford Council was one that we organised. And it was really to get returners to have that face-to-face dialogue with employers around the types of roles that were available, what level of role, what the recruitment process was, and how they supported parents and carers in the workplace, and to be able to have that face-to-face dialogue. We offered those, but also on a less formal basis and on an individual basis. Some employers also offered a coffee and a chat to a returner about the same, you know, with the same aim of discussing, you know, someone's CV, what they wanted to do, how they want, you know, what the best way to get into that sector was, what their, you know, where they advertise, where they should be looking for roles. Those coffee and chats became really very important towards the end of the project, once we'd gone into lockdown and we couldn't offer any face-to-face opportunities. We actually offered more coffee and chats via telephone and via you know, Zoom and Skype at the end of the project than I think we did to begin with. We wanted, one of our expectations was that we would be able to work with employers who would be able to offer either work experience or a work trial to returners. And although we weren't able to offer that with any of the employers we were working with, we were able to link returners to work experience. For example, I think Rochdale Borough Council had a work experience placement, and we were able to, one of our returners was successful in applying to that scheme. I think what's important about this at the moment, when we come to think about Build Back Better later on in the presentation and the kind of recovery plan for Greater Manchester, there is rightly a lot of conversation about all of the school-age young people who have missed their work experience opportunities this summer, and young people who will leave school without having that first experience of a workplace. But actually, work experience isn't just for school-age people. When returners referred themselves to Care and Work and Living, we asked them, you know, we had a referral form and we asked what type of support they wanted, and actually workplace visits and work experience and work trials were often with the most popular support identified by returners. And I think for people who've had a career gap, one of the things that would make people feel more confident about their application is having some recent work experience to make sure their application is as strong as it can be. So I think that's something to bear in mind later on in our conversations. We offered an expenses fund, and just going back to GMCVO's strategic aims of, you know, reducing inequalities, we were very keen to ensure that no one was left out of the support available because they couldn't afford either to travel to an appointment with an employment support organisation, or to travel to a workplace visit, to travel to an interview, or to, you know, to have a decent outfit for an interview, to pay for parking at an interview. So we had an expenses fund that would that allowed us to cover those things, and also in some cases for training courses as well, where people were in quite niche sectors, or were quite experienced, and you know, there wasn't a free course available that was appropriate to their level. We also had a Facebook page that was really a key way of sharing information with our returners. So we would, as well as sharing kind of opportunities with employers and vacancies. We would share on their webinars about, confidence coaching or CV support, and lots of kind of useful articles and toolkits went on our Facebook page as well. And it was a really good way of linking with other community groups through their community pages. And we also wanted to offer an element of peer support as well. We tried to do that via a Facebook group, which wasn't very successful. But what we did find is where we had group activities for returners, we always made sure that there was some time for returners just to network with each other and have that peer support, and those conversations about, yes, I'm a parent with a child with autism as well. This is what I'm finding difficult about getting back into work. I'm going to be quite generic in when I discuss what we asked employers, because we're going to look at this in more detail with Rebecca soon. But really, one of our main asks for employers was, and we asked, but we also supported. I think it's important to say, but our main ask was to ask them to revise their recruitment practices to be more inclusive of returners. We offered some some specific workshops called Breaking Down Barriers workshops, where groups of returners would really analyse an employer's recruitment materials. And we used all of that information. We ran a series of workshops, and we used that to inform our toolkit. And we supported not only specific employers, where we looked at their specific recruitment information, but more generally, we were then able to use that to inform a toolkit, which we shared with all the employers that we worked with, and more widely about their recruitment practices. We also asked them to consider their flexible working offer, both at the point of recruitment. So when thinking about a role, thinking about actually, does this role necessarily have to be worked in an office from 9 to 5? Or actually, could it be job shared? Could it be worked in term time hours? Could it, could there be some flexibility so it was part-time but across 5 days to accommodate a school run or a day centre pick up and drop off times? And again, we used our toolkit to support employers to do that, to increase their awareness really of flexible working. We also asked employers to provide some of those pre-employment support opportunities that we've talked about, so some of those workplace visits, coffee and chat. We had an employer that ran an interview workshop for returners, where they kind of gave good examples of how to prepare for an interview, how to prepare for particular questions, how to prepare for the dreaded group activity, my personal nemesis at interviews. And then every returner that attended that session had a mock interview as well. So we worked with some really supportive employers, it must be said. And then we also asked employers to offer some in-work support. So once beyond the point of recruitment, to actually think about the support they offered to parents and carers in their workforce. And the way we did this was to link them to the Carers UK Employers for Carers scheme, where they would have, which is a membership scheme, but which offers lots of support and resources around supporting carers in the workplace.
Hi everyone. Just before we get onto a little bit of a quiz, I just thought I'd talk through the numbers, so the people that took part in the project. So altogether we had 85 parents and carers that took part. We worked with 23 employment support organisations, so that's some of the organisations that Liz already mentioned that offered the CV coaching, employability courses, things like that. And we worked with 56 employers across all 10 boroughs. The majority of employers that we worked with were in Manchester and Trafford, but we did manage to engage with employers in all 10, which is great. The majority of them had over 250 members of staff, but it was quite split. We had 29 larger employers and 27 who had fewer than 250, so it was a good split there. and I guess the level of engagement was quite varied. As Liz said, some offered things like coffee and chats. Some came to our kind of panel meetings where they could engage with returners, and others kind of downloaded our toolkits and spoke to us about flexible working. And we had 33 employers that had like an initial induction meeting where we could discuss recruitment practices with them, talk to them about what kind of flexible working they offered, and what kind of next steps they could take to kind of improve their flexible working offer. We thought to try and have a think about the inequalities really that stood out to us from the project. We'd have a little bit of a quiz to get you using the chat function as well, about some of the main things that stood out in the project, but also kind of our background, kind of background to it. So thinking about caring as a topic, and I'm sure, having just read your introductions in the chat function, some of you are probably going to know the answers to these, or might even be able to tell us even more than we can, because it looks like there's a real array of what you guys have been working on. But the first question comes from some research that came out last year from Carers UK that you may have seen. It came out for Carers Rights Day in November. And it was asked, the question is at what ages we think men and women have a 50-50 chance of being a carer. So it's a different age for women as it is for men. So I thought, yeah, give us your guess in the chat, or if you know the answer, then you know what you think you know. And bearing in mind, so that's a carer that the definition that I've thought to use was from NHS England, and they use the definition. So they say a carer is anyone, including children and adults, who look after a family member, partner or friend who needs help because of their illness, frailty, disability, mental health problem or an addiction, and cannot cope without their support. The care they give is unpaid. So the answer is a 50-50 chance for women at 46 and for men at 57, which I guess is good that people rightly predicted that it was going to be older for men. And in addition to that, I suppose it's worth noting that from the last census, they found 6.5 million people in the UK are carers, which was an 11% rise from the previous census. But that, of course, is only people who've identified as a carer. They've ticked that box that they know what caring means. They see themselves as a carer. So organisations kind of estimate that to be quite an underestimate. And more recently, Carers UK and the Office of National Statistics have done more polling, and they estimate it to be nearly as high as 8.8 million adults in the UK with that caring responsibility. And 3 million of those in the census said that they were combining care alongside paid work as well. But again, Carers UK think that's even higher. They think it's around 4.87 million people that are juggling work and care, which is 1 in 7 of all workers. So bearing in mind those kind of different ages, how you are more likely to have a caring role when you're younger for a woman, how many of our caring, working, living returners, so that's of our 85 people, how many of them, just a percentage, can you have a guess that you think might have been female? So we had 81% of our cohort were female. In the UK figure, 58% of carers are female, 42% are male. But when we actually look at that in terms of how many hours of care people are providing, it goes up to 60% of women for 50 hours or more a week. And women make up 72% of people receiving carers allowance, which is for people who care over 35 hours or more a week. But yeah, good guesses there. The next question is around sandwich caring, which has been a particular issue for us in this project, and Liz kind of talked about a little bit earlier. But in terms of sandwich caring, so we call sandwich carers people who care for an older or disabled loved one at the same time as they have young children, which is growing every year in the UK as the average age for having children rises and care needs amongst older relatives continues to grow. So the Office of National Statistics, they suggest that 3% of the UK population, which is 1.3 million people, now have this twin responsibility. So just another guess of percentages of how many of our cohort identified as sandwich carers. So that's people who told us that they were a parent and a carer. So we had 55% of our parents and carers were both a parent and a carer, which for us emphasises the need for employers to kind of fully understand all the different facets of flexible working, such as term time hours, flexi time, job shares, in order for returners to balance work and care. And they're not necessarily, you know, just caring for one person, but they've also got childcare to consider as well. Interestingly, like the peak age for these two family responsibilities to coincide is 40 to 44 for women and 45 to 49 for men. And it's women who are more likely to face the pressure of simultaneously shouldering responsibility for the young and for the old at the age when many women are at the peak of their careers, often raising families of their own. Their aging parents are also then starting to need support, which is why that's becoming more and more talked about with sandwich caring. Something that I think we're possibly a little bit surprised about from our cohort of returners was when we looked at education levels. So if you could have a think about, just have a guess of how many in percentage wise you thought were degree level educated. So that's our parents and carers who had a degree. So I'll give you that answer. So that one was 43% were degree level educated, which for us reinforced the need for employers to offer flexibility for experienced and senior staff as well as at entry level, which isn't always something that employers offer. And research has shown that often women return to part-time, less senior roles in order to find flexibility that they need to balance that work and care. If this just means that women then work fewer hours and for a lower hourly rate when returning to work, despite having that experience and often having a degree as well. The next question relates to our expenses fund and the importance of kind of trying to help break down those barriers to getting into work. So if you could just have a think, and I've got a few options of, I find this quite interesting, but the average cost of attending a face-to-face job interview in the UK. So there's a couple of options. You've got £21, £31, £41 or £51. And that includes like your transport, maybe if you're buying a new outfit, getting there, if there's any kind of technology or you need to get copies of your passport, that sort of thing, all taken into account. Yeah, there's a few guesses there that you've hit it with it's £41 is the average cost of attending a face-to-face job interview, which according to Debut, who did this research, they said that this was equivalent to 8% of the average family's weekly household spend, which I guess just shows the importance of having that beneficiary expenses fund for our project, as we could potentially cover the costs of interview clothing, transport costs, respite care, childcare, and things like that to help break down those barriers really of finding employment. We also asked our parents and carers if they were willing to return to a different sector or level in order to find flexible working. Again, have a think about the percentage of how many of those were willing to return to a different sector or level for that flexibility. So if you just have a guess of a percentage. I think Liz has also mentioned how many people were also interested in work trials and workplace visits and coaching and support to understand different sectors as well. Wasn't quite 90, but it was 59%, which again, just to us, just showed how important it was for people to find flexible employment, that they were willing to completely change sector and sometimes, you know, go into a job at a lower level than what they'd previously been doing if it was able to suit their kind of family and work-life balance. Now, a lot has been talked about recently and flexible working during COVID. And as Gail said earlier, flexible working or working at home doesn't always have to be what we regard as flexible working, but Working Families recently released some new research where they'd surveyed 1,063 parents and carers in the UK of dependent children under 18. And all of these respondents were in work during the lockdown, although some were on leave, some were furloughed, but it asked about their experiences of flexible working both before lockdown and during it, and their aspirations for kind of flexible working afterwards. And 65% of respondents were working flexibly beforehand. So bearing that in mind, how many do you think are working flexibly, I guess, now or when they were surveyed, so during lockdown? If you can have a guess of that at a percentage. Yeah, so it has gone up quite a bit. I guess unsurprisingly, there's been quite a jump in those numbers. And interestingly, they found that 47% of those surveyed said they'd been working extremely flexibly or very flexibly during lockdown, whereas it had been 23% before. So although 65% of those people had already been working flexibly, they didn't regard it as extremely flexible. I guess it was like a little bit of flexibility, whereas it completely kind of jumped up during lockdown. And of the people beforehand that weren't working flexibly at all, 72% were now able to work flexibly. So the most common ways of flexible working that had been allowed by employers was working from home and flexi time. And then just our final question is, bearing that in mind, is that the same research from Working Families, which asked people about whether they wanted to retain flexible working post COVID-19, and they asked them about kind of their experiences of it and if they were planning to make any changes to their work patterns when lockdown was finished. So out of 10, this is an out of 10, how many parents and carers want their workplace to retain flexible working post COVID-19? Yeah, it's 20 out of 10. I mean, that's very that's an optimistic one. It's a bit of a strange answer because it's more than 9, which, so I suppose it's 9 point something. So I guess you get a point if you're 9 or 10 there. But yeah, more than 9 said that they would like flexible working to be retained post lockdown. And 48% actually of all the respondents said they planned to make changes to work more flexibly after lockdown. So it had made a real impact on their life, and it was something they wanted to continue when kind of working got back to normal. So thanks for taking part in that, and hopefully it's given you a bit of an introduction into what's coming next.
So I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the asks of employers and our support for employers, I mentioned our toolkits. Rebecca in a moment is going to talk more in more detail about the toolkits, and we hope that lots of you have had a chance to look at them before coming to this webinar. But I just wanted to touch on how we develop those toolkits, particularly around co-production with our stakeholders. Okay. So one of our main kind of methods of co-production was our panel, and our panel was a mix of employers, employment support organisations, and returners. it wasn't a closed membership group. It was always voluntary. We had 3 of them throughout the lifetime of the project. We held 3 panel meetings. We'd intended for 4, but obviously our last one was cancelled because of lockdown. But what those panel meetings did was allow us to bring together, as I say, both employers, returners and employment support organisations to have their input and to guide us in particular aspects of our work. And the panel was really key to putting together our toolkit. From the beginning of the project, we did realise there was a lot of information out there about what flexible working was, but it wasn't necessarily formatted in a way that would appeal to employers. So there were lots of research reports, lots of quite long documents by people like CIPD, and we realised that employers actually weren't necessarily engaging with that material. And so what we did, we pulled our panel in September. We put a panel together and we shared some examples that we'd found of toolkits, and we made sure we had their feedback about what they thought was important to include and what they wouldn't want to see. So it was interesting, for example, in the panel were really clear that we were putting together a toolkit about flexible working. There wasn't a one-size-fits-all approach, that actually we needed something that would be an overview for those employers that were already on their journey and were thinking about maybe developing their offer, and then something much more in depth for employers that potentially were only just starting to think about flexible working and maybe weren't aware of all the different options, maybe haven't thought about what annualised hours meant as opposed to term time hours, or job share, or what the difference between flexi time and part time is. And so we needed a document that had a little bit more detail and substance to it. Employers were also really clear, the employers that were around the table, that we shouldn't be including 0 hours as a form of flexible working. It wasn't something they wanted to be associated with, and so we worked with them to create something that we thought they would want to engage with because they'd been part of its development. We also, there we go, and I've referenced this before, we held a series of breaking down barriers workshops, and unlike the panel, they were just for returners, and it was where we held 4 workshops in total, each one looking at a specific employer's recruitment materials. So GMCVO, we were first up. We thought we better practice what we preach. And we were recruiting at the time, so it was timely that we did it. But we were involved, Stockport Homes Group, People First Housing Association in Manchester, and BAM, the construction firm. And what those breaking down barriers sessions allowed returners to do was to really analyse the different different types of recruitment information. So from a work for us page on a website, through to a specific job advert, to a job description and person spec, through to a LinkedIn profile as well for bigger employers like BAM, and really look at things that either appealed to them and kind of created the impression from that employer that they would be open to and willing to support parents and carers, and also things that were maybe inadvertently barriers to parents and carers applying. We took all of that evidence, as well as feeding it back to the individual employers. We then took that and collated that, and that became the third part of our toolkit. So we made sure that our toolkit was very evidence-based. The other thing to mention actually with our breaking down barriers, if we go back again to our strategic aims about inequalities, where we were holding a physical workshop, a physical meeting at the St Thomas Centre for returners to come together and look at that information, we were also mindful of the fact that there would be many more returners that maybe couldn't make the meeting on that day, couldn't fit it in around parental care and responsibilities, and so we ensured that there was a way for those returners to be involved. So we always created a survey monkey that went alongside those workshops, so that people could look at the information and give their responses at a time that was convenient for them. And I think, you know, as we kind of come out of the world of lockdown, I think there's going to be a lot more conversations about hybrid meetings and having, you know, physical meetings running alongside a virtual meeting. And I think in our own little way on Caring, Working, Living, we were already starting to think that way last year, that actually not everyone's voice will be heard if you only have one meeting in one place at one time. Oops, wrong way. Oh. There we go. Finally, when we, the other thing to say about our co-production is that when we consulted, particularly around our report that we published towards the end of the project around jobs boards, so boards like Indeed and Total Jobs, we did a piece of research around kind of how useful, you know, the returners' experience of using those boards, as well as the employer's experience. And again, we tried to make that consultation as accessible and as wide as possible. So we held a panel event. We did some consultation at other events that was just for returners. There were other employability support events that we knew were happening. And we created online surveys for both returners and for employers, just to make sure we were, you know, being as inclusive as we possibly could be in our co-production. The other thing I forgot to say when I spoke about the panel, and I think it is pertinent, is that when we, those panel meetings that we held, they were mostly hosted, and more often than not hosted by an employer. And actually we thought that was really important, that it wasn't GMCVO hosting, this was a partnership, and it was important that an employer hosted those meetings. But also, again, it was another way of getting returners into a workplace, getting returners into that mindset of, oh, actually I'm going to put on a, you know, a smart set of clothes because I'm going to the, you know, the building at Deloitte or at Lang O'Rourke. So I'm going to, you know, I'm going to dress for the occasion, but also I'm going to use it to network. And I think that was important again for us, that actually in our co-production, as much as our stakeholders were giving, you know, helping us and supporting us and giving us information that we wanted from them, that they also got something out of it, that actually there was that opportunity for them to network with employers and with employment support organisations, so that they felt, and with their peers as well, so that they really felt that there was benefit in that co-production process. And again, as with everything on the project, we wanted to make sure that we weren't inadvertently creating a barrier to people attending in terms of cost of attending a meeting. So we always reimburse travel expenses. We always made sure that people, you know, who needed to you know, to get a cab because it was close, you know, they felt like they were cutting it fine after a school drop off, for example, would be able to attend that meeting. So we tried to make those meetings as accessible as we possibly could.
So the toolkits themselves, hopefully you've had a chance to have a look at them, because they should have been emailed out before this webinar. So don't worry if you can't see it on the screen. It's just to kind of give you an idea of which one I'm talking about. So we have 3 parts to the toolkit, quite a lot of different elements making up part 1. So part 1 has 4 different bits to it. We started off with this flexible working visual. Again, this was feedback from employers. That there was, as Liz said, kind of something else already existed that was quite visual, that they said that they really liked, as having something quite simple, with all the different, well, there's probably more options than this of flexible working, but the most popular options for flexible working kind of just listed out. They also said that they really wanted to have the legal position kind of prominent in place. So that's saying about how you everyone has the legal right to request flexible working after 26 weeks. So they wanted that on there. We had a designer an external designer who kind of made sure all the different parts were consistent with GMCBO's branding, and she's made them, we think, look quite kind of eye-catching, and got the different graphics on there that are quite consistent, and it all kind of fits together quite nicely. But yeah, that was our first part. So the next part, we created a guide to flexible working. So it's basically a more in-depth version of our visual, and it breaks down each of the types of flexible working. It explains what it is in a bit more detail, but I think quite importantly, it's got the benefits and the challenges of each one. So here's just an example of one which is working from home on a regular basis, which obviously a lot of people have now been doing. But it breaks down the benefits, so that could be saving on overheads, saving on travel time and costs, allowing more flexibility in the hours that you work. It can also make the employer look more attractive to potential employees who can provide a wider catchment area of staff. And some of the challenges can be communication and trust, which might deteriorate when an employee rarely sees their manager. Home workers can become stressed and feel isolated. Home workers could find it hard to switch off and could become fatigued and less productive. And career development may suffer if people are missing out on those opportunities to engage with people in the office. Obviously, that's kind of taking in mind if you're working from home on a regular basis, but most of the other people are in the office. But yeah, that guide kind of breaks down each one to help employers think about all the different elements to flexible working. The next part we developed two checklists. The first one was getting ready for flexible working. So this was something that employers fed back to us as they thought this would be really helpful. So it gives you an interactive checklist. So they said, again, it'd be something useful to have something they could print and tick, or work as a tick box interactively as a PDF. And that gives you suggestions, so including things like consulting with your employees, looking at your existing flexible working offer. Is there much of a take-up? Does it actually kind of work for your colleagues that do have caring responsibilities or parental responsibilities? How to work out the details. Do you want to engage with an employee, a reference group? Is there kind of staff that will be able to give feedback on their what kind of they, oh, is that me? No, I don't need to do that. On what they think would be useful, or how much they would want to use the flexible working if it was introduced. So the next checklist that accompanies that one was reviewing your flexible working policies and the next steps. And this again was something that employers mentioned to us. I had a conversation with a co-op group actually, and they said that they have flexible working for some staff, but it's not something that they've really analysed, and it could have just it's just existed and it's never been improved upon, and there might be different options that they haven't thought about. So we've included things on how to evaluate the scheme, and kind of seeing the bigger picture. So that could be promoting case studies, and sharing kind of examples of staff members that have been working flexibly. Have you got a successful job share, for instance, that you can promote, and also becoming a bit of an ambassador. So there's various different awards that recognise flexible working. There's organisations like Carers UK who have a carer confident employer scheme where you can be awarded as being carer confident, and flexible working is a key part of that. Likewise, working families offer recognition for employers that have that element of flexibility. So things like that, when you're reviewing your flexible working, there's kind of like a next step that you could take. The next thing we looked at for the toolkits was around interview practice. So this was a quote that we wrote down during one of our panel meetings, and one of our returners, she said, "I have a lot of skills from caring for my son, but employers always focus on paid experience. I never get the chance to discuss it during interviews, but these skills could be a lot of value to a workplace." so bearing that in mind, we were thinking during the panel about interview practices, and we created the next part of the checklist, which is about the interviews themselves. And we thought about before the interview, during the interview, and after the interview. And again, we've got check boxes so that people can do that interactively. And some of the things we took from the panel, so there was things that we wouldn't have thought of ourselves. Some things we took from returners, from employers, from employment support organisations, suggestions that everybody had. And before the interview can include things like giving people plenty of notice about when an interview is going to take place, which obviously is courteous and polite to do that for anybody. But if you've got to arrange respite care or childcare or your transport, then it's even more important to kind of give that notice. Telling people how many people are going to be on the interview panel, the kind of the structure of the interview, especially if you haven't been to a job interview in a long time. It can be just all these extra things that might make someone feel uncertain about the day, but like giving people as much information as you can. And then even during the interview and after the interview, there's things on there about giving people feedback afterwards. You know, you can have job interviews where you never hear anything, but especially giving someone some feedback on what they might be able to improve on if they didn't get the role. And each of these, this part has, we included some gold standards, so some examples of what a few other organisations are doing, but also kind of those extra steps that you could take. So one of them was before the interview, it could be helpful to show the candidate around the building by someone who isn't involved in the interview process. I know a lot of organisations do this, but we thought it can help break the ice and relax the candidate so they can perform well during the interview. It can also reassure a returner of the diversity of the workforce. Something else we developed for interviews was this interviewer prompt card, and again this was suggested by an employer. It was Boma and Kirkland actually, and during one of our panels, and she said that she thought all the toolkits were really great, but it's not necessarily something you can have during an interview when you're just about to meet the candidate. And even if you in HR might be aware of the importance of kind of the inclusive recruitment, the hiring manager may not know all of this background information. So they said, let's have something that they could just laminate or have in front of them. And that talks about, it's got a definition of what a carer is, talks about the business benefits of hiring a diverse workforce, remembering that you might also be a carer one day in the future, and just kind of think about the not hiring in your own image, and being a parent or carer is different for everyone. So just because someone's got caring responsibilities at home doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be distracted from their work. And then, oh, my battery running low, tells me. The final part of the toolkit was, as Liz mentioned, about our breaking down barriers sessions. So that was when we got our parents and carers to feedback on different employers' kind of recruitment packages, and we developed our final part of the toolkit around that. So that was kind of giving our suggestions to employers on what they could do to attract parents and carers to the workforce. So that's thinking about their website, thinking about their job adverts and their job descriptions and their person specifications. So that could be things like, if you've got a staff carers network, have you even mentioned it on your website? So if I was a carer looking at the website thinking, I'd like to work for Vodafone, do Vodafone talk about all these different offers that they have? If they've got flexible working, is it on their website, or is it mentioned during an interview? Or is it just kind of mentioned on your first day of employment, which would mean that parents and carers wouldn't necessarily apply for those roles. So that's got lots of tips in there. And again, has gold standard examples. So we've got Deloitte, Lloyds Banking Group and Urbed, who were all part of our project, and they've all got information on their websites about the support that they give to parents or carers, that we thought was really good if you were kind of job searching and thinking about applying for a role there. So there are some examples that other employers can hopefully follow. So that's the kind of broad overview of our toolkits, which we shared with all 56 employers that were part of the project, as well as promoting them on social media and in different working groups that we're involved with, to try and get the word out. And they are now held on the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter website, as well as Skills for Care website, which is great. So we're kind of continuing to try and get them more promoted and, you know, used by more and more employers across Greater Manchester.
So this is our chance now to have a little bit of a discussion. So for more people to get involved. And I'm going to, in order to do that in a moment, I'm going to split us into 4 breakout rooms. There's about 20 of us left, so we'll try and do 4 groups of 5, I think. But the question I'd like us to think about is how to ensure the learning from this project influences Greater Manchester's Build Back Better movement, which aims to create a resilient and inclusive economy. And just, I'm not sure, there'll be people, you know, on the webinar that are really familiar with Build Back Better and have been really involved in it, but maybe people who haven't been as involved. So just so we're on an equal playing field, as it were, Build Back Better is essentially Greater Manchester's kind of post-COVID recovery plan for our economy. But also a chance to kind of pause and reflect on the learning from the last 3 months, really. Particularly from an employment point of view, I think there's some, we've learned that a lot of the employees that have kept going to work every day, that haven't been able to work from home, and that have been, you know, delivering the services that we've all relied on to keep us going. So, you know, our supermarket workers and our delivery drivers and our public transport workers are often employees that are in the least secure and lowest paid roles. And I think one of Build Back Better's aims is to address that as we move forward. I think the whole ethos of Build Back Better is not to go back, but to go forward somewhere better, really. There's also learning around the fact that when we, you know, we can take radical change really quickly when we need to. So we've seen that when we all stopped using public transport and driving our cars, it made a radical difference to our air quality. And I think critically, there's you know, an acknowledgement of the actual intrinsic link between the health and well-being of the people in Greater Manchester and the health and well-being of our economy. So what I'd like us to discuss in our breakout rooms in a moment is all the learning that we've been talking about over the last hour around flexible working and the benefits of flexible working, and, you know, how to ensure that people aren't left out of this inclusive economy, how to ensure that, you know, we are part of that Build Back Better movement. Important to say that it is a movement, it's not a closed membership group, it's a movement that involves obviously employers, the private sector, but also the public sector and the voluntary sector. How we actually, how we can influence this movement. So, and also how it relates to your role and what you do. Whilst we're finishing off, if everyone just wants, or, you know, someone from each group just wants to put something in the chat about their conversation, that would be absolutely great. We are not going to go through any more slides, but we will just say that actually the presentation will be available, I think on, well, Gail will tell you more, but I think on the Work and Equalities Institute's website, and I think it will be emailed round to participants as well. I could be wrong, but there's a list of resources in there. So some of the things, particularly some of the reports that Rebecca was referencing, they're all listed on the last page of the presentation. So that might be useful. And the very last page has got an email address that both Rebecca and I have got access to. So if there are any questions, if you're like me, you think of them afterwards and think, well, why didn't I ask that? You can email us on that address, and we'll be able to respond. I wouldn't bother with the telephone number that's on there. No one is manning the phones at St Thomas Centre right now. Yeah, that's a nice point about whether we can how we can still deliver some of those workplace visits and work experience that we didn't manage to deliver during the project. But yeah, I think definitely part of Build Back Better will be to ask employers to keep getting involved with that, because it's going to be important for a lot of people across Greater Manchester now, not just returners, but all of those young people that have come out of school without any experience of work as well. So yeah, that's a conversation that I'm happy to continue being part of, definitely.
I think I mean, just to say, while people are putting in, I mean, what's been really fascinating about this is actually how the co-production aspect, and how you have but you know, both how you've involved employers and got them on side, and the checklists, and the, you know, some sort of really concrete ideas, because in the university and the academic section there's a lot of big emphasis on impact and making an impact, and how can you make sure your research makes impact. And by doing what you've done, you know, it's obvious that it's actually in tune with what employers want and what the carers and returners were after as well. So it's yeah, it's really quite exciting as a way forward, a co-production method. Sorry.
It was good as well, because when we asked for feedback at the end of the project as well about what people had most kind of valued about caring, working, living, one of the main things they said was attending the panels and having the opportunity to engage with each other. So that was really good.
Yeah, no, it sounds brilliant. Right, so I know we've come to the end of the session, so I mean, yes, the resources will be made available. Lindsay, our wonderful research manager, will be helping us do that. We just want to say a big thank you to Liz and Rebecca for a really fascinating presentation, getting us all actually interacting as well. Yeah, and we'll make sure the resources are available, and as Liz was saying, if any of you had any questions, please, yeah, we can send them on to Liz, or you can send them to Liz directly, because we've unfortunately run out of time, but it's been great. Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone for attending. Thank you very much.
Thanks for organising it.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for all your support. Thanks for inviting us, and thanks for your support.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant, and the toolkits look great as well. At an aesthetic level, never mind.
I guess that's something else that people can do. You know, if everybody knows somebody who works somewhere, get them to share it with their HR or their line managers, or get them to think about what they could do in their workplace.
Yeah, I mean, can we put them on the Work Equalities Institute sort of website? I know we've
decided, absolutely.
We can talk to Lindsay.
Absolutely.
Yeah, great. Okay, thank you, everybody. Thank you.